This is part 18 of jQuery tutorial. In this video, we'll discuss what is JSON, JSON arrays, and nested JSON object. What is JSON? JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. JSON is a lightweight data interchange format that's widely used by applications these days. JSON is an easier to use alternative to XML. Let's say, for example, we want to represent an employee data. Let's say we want to capture employee's first name, last name, gender, and salary. If we want to represent such an employee's data in XML format, this is how we would do it. We would create an employee element, and within that we would have first name, last name, gender, and salary elements. So here we are representing the employee's data using XML format. Now if we want to represent the same employee data in JSON format, this is how we would do it. Here employee.json is a JSON object. We would create a JSON object using a pair of curly braces, and within the curly braces we have got name value pairs. So here first name, last name, gender, and salary are the property names of this employee JSON object. Todd here is the value for first name property. So we would separate the property names and their values using a colon symbol, and multiple properties are separated using a comma. So here at the moment we have got 4 properties within this employee JSON object, but you can have as many properties as you want. So this is how we would create a JSON object. Now if we want to read data from this JSON object, we would simply use the property names. For example, if we want to read the first name property value, we would simply say employee.json, which is our variable here, JSON object, dot first name. Similarly, if you want to read salary property value, dot salary. In fact, if you're using tools like Visual Studio, as soon as you type employee.json and as soon as you type dot, you would see in the IntelliSense all the property names of this employee.json object. So let's look at this in action. Let's flip to Visual Studio. So within our jQuery ready function, let's create a variable. Let's call this employee.json equals, so we create a JSON object using a pair of curly braces. So the first property that we want is first name, and we would separate the property names and their values using a colon symbol. So the value for this property is going to be Todd, and the second property is going to be last name. So we are separating multiple properties using comma. So the value for last name is going to be Grover. Third property is going to be gender, and the value is going to be male, and the last property is salary, and the value is going to be 50,000. So here employee.json is in JSON format. Now let's say we have a div element within the body element. So let's actually give it an ID. Let's call it div result. So what we want to do is display the employee.json property and its value in this div element. So we want the property name as well and its value. Okay, so let's create a variable here. Let's name this result and initialize that to an empty string. So result plus equals, so we want the string first name equals employee.json. So we want to read the first name property value. So I'm using this JSON object employee.json dot first name should give us the value of that property. And look at this, as soon as I type dot within the IntelliSense, we can see all the property names of the employee.json object. So we want to read first name property value, and then let's append an HTML break so we get each property name and its value in a separate line. So I'm going to actually make 3 more copies of this, and last name equals employee.json dot last name, and similarly gender equals employee.json dot gender, and finally salary equals employee.json dot salary. So we have that string within this result variable. So we want to find this div element and set the HTML for that. So I'm going to use jQuery ID selector, and the ID selector is pound. So find element by ID, and the element that we want to find is result div, and set it as HTML. Alright, so let's save these changes, and when we reload, we should say all the property names and their respective values. So here is the example where we're creating a JSON object and reading the data that's present within that JSON object and displaying that within the div element. Now, what if you want to store more than one employee data in the JSON object? At the moment, look at this JSON object only stores one employee object, but let's say I also have another employee, Sarah, and I want to store her details as well within this object. So if we want to store multiple employee data within the JSON object, that's when we use JSON arrays. So a JSON array can contain multiple objects, and to create a JSON array, all you would do is use a pair of square brackets. So here we have a square bracket here and another here, okay, and within that square brackets we will have our respective employee objects which are in JSON format. So within the first pair of curly braces we have our first JSON object, and then the second JSON object is present in the second set of curly braces, and we separate these objects using a comma. Okay, so let's look at that in action. So I use a pair of square brackets. So this is our first JSON object. Now I'm going to separate the first and second JSON object using a comma, and then I'm going to use another pair of curly braces, and within this set of curly braces we are going to have our second JSON object, and it's going to have the same set of properties. So I'm going to make a copy of that and change the values. So Sarah is going to the first name, Baker is the last name, gender is female, and salary is 40,000. Okay, so here employeeJSON is a JSON array which at the moment contains two JSON objects. Okay, so now if we want to retrieve data from the JSON array, you would index that using its index position. So let's say, for example, I want to retrieve the first employee's first name. To do that, I would simply use the variable name, which is employeeJSON. This is a JSON array, so I'm going to index that with the index position of the object that I want to retrieve. So employeeJSON of 0 is going to return us this JSON object. From that JSON object I want maybe first name property. So when we reload this page, we should see Todd within the div element. Similarly, if you want the second JSON object, you would use index position 1, and that should return Sarah. So to store multiple JSON objects, we would use a JSON array. Another way to store multiple employees in the JSON object is by nesting them. So at the moment here we're using a JSON array, but you could also nest them. So instead of using a JSON array, I'm going to nest these JSON objects. And to nest the JSON objects, instead of using square brackets, we would use an additional pair of curly braces. So I'm going to use a curly brace here. So that's the opening curly brace, and I'm going to close that here. Okay, and then this is our first JSON object. So I'm going to put a string here. I'm going to call this Todd colon your first JSON object. Okay, and then here is our second JSON object. So I'm going to call this Sarah colon, and that's our second JSON object. Let's actually format this properly by pressing Ctrl K and D. Okay, so we have Todd employee object and Sarah employee object. Now here we are nesting the objects. So let's say, for example, I want to retrieve Todd employee's salary. If that's the case, since this is not an array, here we have nested the objects. So I can simply say employeeJSON dot, and look at that, I can see Todd and Sarah here. So we want Todd salary. So employeeJSON dot Todd dot, we should see salary property. And now when we reload this page, we should see Todd salary which is 50,000. Similarly, if we want to retrieve any of the properties of Sarah employee object, you would simply say Sarah.salary should give you salary, which is 40,000. Now, this JSON formatted data is widely used these days by many applications. In our upcoming videos, we'll discuss where we could use this JSON formatted data. Thank you for listening and have a great day.